Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to make a start. Well, good morning and welcome to CYP meeting. Bore da, croeso I cyfarfod plant a pobl ifanc. I'm Tudor Thomas and I'm chairing this meeting. I'm elected member for Priory in Abergavenny. And before we go into the agenda, I'd just like to go around and for everybody to introduce themselves. I'll start with my vice chair on my left.
County Councillor Laura Jones for Wisham and vice chair of this committee.
Matthew Gatehouse, Head of Policy and Governance, and here today in a scrutiny capacity.
Helen Power, I'm from the EAS and I'm the Principal Challenge Advisor for Monmouthshire.
Ed Price, EAS Assistant Director.
Tyrone Stokes, Finance Manager for Social Care and Health.
Nikki Wellington, Finance Manager for Children and Young People.
Councillor Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castlewood and Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Faye Middleton, NASUWT.
Pete Strong, National Education Union.
Councillor Louise Brown, Shire Newton, Ward Councillor and member of this committee.
Maggie Harris, Mask Representative and also Governor at Derryview Primary School.
Martin Grokert, I'm the elected member for Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny and I'm a member of this committee.
County Councillor Malcolm Lane, member for Mardy and a member of this committee.
Sharon Randall-Smith, Head of Service, CYP.
Okay, thank you for that. Declarations of interest.
I'd like to declare non-prejudicial interest as Chair of Governors at Llantilio Patholi Primary School and also at King Henry VIII Comprehensive School.
Councillor Maureen Powell.
I declare that I'm a Governor at King Henry VIII Comprehensive School, non-prejudicial.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yeah, Mountain House School is obviously in my ward, but I think I've, you know, obviously speaking from the ward perspective, and you know, I don't have any relatives or anybody else who's going to be affected by any decision in relation to this. So I'm arguing generally from a ALN point of view. Thank you.
I declare I'm on the governing body of Ysgol Gymraeg Abergavenny. I don't think that's going to be pertinent today, but I'll just declare it anyway. In terms of the public open forum, I haven't been informed of anyone that wishes to address this this meeting. Apologies for absence. Missed that out actually. David Jones, County Councillor David Jones for Criconi. All right, and then I've got Mike Fowler and Elizabeth Thomas have also offered their apologies, as has Joe Watkins, County Councillor in Caldicot. We'll move now then to agenda item 4. It's the quarterly scrutiny of the revenue and capital monitoring for 2019-20, the outturn statement, and I'm going to hand over to Nikki Wellington and Tyrone Stokes to take us through the relevant agenda item.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. I'll take you through the first part of the introductory to this year's first quarterly monitoring for 2019-2020. I'll go through the children's element of social care, and I'll pass over to my colleague Nikki Wellington, who will take you through the school's forecast. If I draw your attention to section 2 on page 1, the recommendations, and more notably 2.1, and that's the forecast net revenue deficit of £2.4 million. 2.2, noting that 88% has been achieved of the budget setting savings as part of the budget setting process by Council. And 2.3, the effects on capital and more notably the anticipated £24,000 overspend. If I take you to section 3.2 on page 2, and that's the revenue outturn position in detail. And if I draw your attention to the children's services element of social care, and against a budget of £11.937 million, there's an anticipated £2.296 million overspend at month 2. As part of that overspend, if I take you to page 4, and sections 3.5, 3.7, 3.8 and 3.9 is trying to put into context the effects of the £2.296 million overspend in children's social care, is more notably the looked after children numbers that we've seen coming into the service, and the effects on the cost of placements and the associated knock-on costs in terms of legal provision, transport provision, and the staffing requirements to service those looked after children numbers. If I take you to page 13, what we've tried to put into context, and is something I mentioned to you in the last CYP select, being the 18-19 year in outturn, is the unit costing within children's social care. And what we try to do is show a range of unit costs. For example, to place a looked after child in an house fostering has an average unit annual cost of £34,000. But if you look at a looked after child placed in external placement provision, that could exhibit a cost in excess of £300,000 a year. So it's just to try and put that overspend and that spend in children's services into some sort of context for you as members. If I take you then to the director's commentary, and the director's commentary on page 14 does try to tease out for you as members the month 2 forecast for children's services, and since November 2018 we have seen a 20% increase in looked after children numbers. They've risen from November 2018 being 148 to 178 at the end of May 2019, and that's what we based our month 2 forecast. That's an increase on 30 since the start of this financial year to the end of May. For those 2 months, we saw an extra 6 looked after children enter the system, of which 4 went to external placement provision. And if I remind you of the unit costing, the average cost for that per year is in excess of £300,000 a year per looked after child. So you can try and work out the maths that way to try and quantify the spend and the overspend I'm reporting for you today. Sorry, do you want to? Oh, I'm really sorry.
We've got the numbers at the side. So
Oh,
if you could give us the
Oh, sorry, I am.
side, that's right.
Right, okay, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, sorry about that. That's,
Yeah, 3.22, isn't it?
so yeah, 3.22. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sorry, I'll refer to the note number rather than the pages. Thanks for pointing that out. So yeah, what I've just been going through now is 3.22, and that's the unit costing, and then the director's commentary. Recommendation 2.2, I mentioned about the savings. If I pick up the note number, the savings are shown in 3.15. And within social care and health, the savings were 1.246 million, of which 41,000 relates to children's social care, and it was around an anticipated grant for looked after children. Following that up, the Welsh Government is being amalgamated into a social care pressures grant of 738,000 that was given to the Directorate. Part of that does feature in the children's social care forecast. For children's services, there's no capital budget. And before I move over to Nikki, do you want to save up questions for children's social care into the end, and after Nicky's given you the school's forecast. Is that okay?
Yes, I think...
Do the questions after?
Yes, we'll have questions at the end, obviously, and thanks, Tyrone, for that.
Okay, thanks.
Listen to Nicky, and then we'll have questions on both sections, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back then to 3.22, so I'll go through children and young people first of all, that's the Central Directorate, then I'll go through schools, and then I'll touch on capital. In terms of Central CYP, the overspend position at the end of month 2 was 391,000. The majority of this was ALN, and actually within ALN, the overspend was 618,000. If I just give you a quick overview of where that split is. So 223, about a third of it was for School Action Plus. Now this is obviously the resources that we put within our local schools to support children. Now this might be a one-to-one support or more likely a group support, so a TA with a small number of pupils to support those pupils through their education. 275,000 was a shortfall in the recruitment income for Mountain House. And I know that's later on the agenda as well to discuss that. But yes, so that was a shortfall on what we were anticipating to receive this year for Mountain House for placement costs. And the remainder of that was split between out-of-county provision for our pupils and independent provision for our pupils where we can't support them within Monmouthshire. The other area of overspend was breakfast clubs. The shortfall on income at the moment is calculated about 78,000, but obviously we've got a new intake of pupils now that come in September, so we'll be monitoring that as we move through the financial year. We've made some savings to offset those overspends, so there was 135,000 that we were able to release from the maternity. This is without any effect on schools in any way. As you know, they pay into a maternity scheme. We continue to support that scheme, but there was an underspend on that scheme over the last financial year, so we were able to release that. 53,000 will be found through efficiencies within the Directorate, and I know managers are looking at that at the moment. And as you are also aware, we have 300,000 to support school-based redundancies. The good news is we've seen less redundancies come through this year, so we are able to release 100,000 from that. I'll make it very clear that if we do have schools that need to make redundancies throughout the year, then obviously that would be fully supported, and we continue to monitor that as we move forward. If we turn now to schools, which is on 3.29, which is page 28 of the electronic pack and page 22 of the printed pack. We had opening reserves of 232 deficit, which at that point was 15 schools were in a deficit position. The latest at month 2 was we had 850,000 deficit collectively for our schools, with 14 schools in a deficit. You'll be aware of the recovery plan process. We've talked about this at this meeting before. There are a number of schools that are meeting with the Chief Officer, myself, and the Cabinet Member for Resources and the Cabinet Member for Education to go through their recovery plan. Where a recovery plan is already in place, and there are a number of schools that are already in place, obviously we are monitoring against that recovery plan, but where a school has gone into a deficit, we will be meeting to agree those deficits positions at the moment and get recovery plans in place. Just moving back up to 3.23, which is on page 22 or 16. This is just looking at the capital for the Directorate. You'll be aware that we've opened our 2 new schools, one in Caldecott and one in Monmouth. So our capital has reduced significantly for this financial year. We haven't got many, obviously we've opened the school, so we've just got the tail end of Monmouth now, with the grounds works being done. So we've got about 3 million left in capital for children and young people. At the moment we're anticipating a small overspend of 24,000. Okay, Chair, thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicky, and thank you, Tyrone. We'll go to questions now. Shall we start with the social budget to start with? Questions directed to Tyrone, please. Silence. A question that I had earlier in the pre-meeting was, are there any sort of known factors why the increase in looked after children, and is it just Monmouthshire, or is it across South Wales, or across Wales, or across Wales and England?
Part of the budget does refer to this not being just a Monmouthshire one, it is a national one. It's one that's featured in the press quite a lot. Within Monmouthshire, some of it is court-directed, and if the court direction is to place the child into care or a certain provision, that's what the local authority adheres to. We try and have the educate preventative support, but it may come to a point where the child or the family circumstances warrant that that child has to come into the looked after care system.
Thanks, Tyrone. No questions from the floor? Brown.
Sorry, is this on the general report or on a specific?
It's on the social, it's on the children's social care budget to start with.
Oh, right, so it's on looked after children, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, when you throw it open for general questions, I'll ask a question then. Thank you.
Nikki, then questions now then in terms of the schools budget. Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Wellington, I'm glad I haven't got your job. I think training in smoke and mirrors might be very useful when the only crumb of comfort you can offer us is the rate of redundancies is slowing down. Well, when you've got rid of most people, it's almost inevitable that the rate of further decline is going to slow down. I'm in now starting my second year as the chair of a governing body of one of our primary schools. One of the first things I had to do when I was first elected as chair was to hold exit interviews with several senior staff who were being made redundant. People who were providing small group or one-to-one services with children with a range of additional learning needs. That process has continued at the end of my first full year as a chair of a governing body. We really are scraping a barrel in terms of trying to ensure that we meet children's needs at an individual level. Now, last year, the fair funding formula was subject to yet more smoke and mirrors when it was, despite I believe, our legal duty to operate a fair funding arrangements and to ensure schools operate within budgets, for a year we accepted they couldn't. It seems to me that the situation is now worse than it was then. I wonder if you could tell me where we are now with sustaining the fair funding formula and the number and the percentage of our schools who are either in deficit or by the end of this end of this financial year will be in deficit, because I think we're rapidly heading for a situation where there is no money and schools are finding it increasingly difficult to meet the needs of their children.
I'll take that in three parts if I can. I'll do the easy part first. The number of schools in a deficit we're anticipating at the moment is 14. So my quick rule of thumb maths, it's probably about 45% of our schools we're anticipating at the end of month 2. Obviously, I'm hoping to see an improvement at month 7. But you know, until we start doing that monitoring, I can't bring you those figures yet. I will say that we did fully fund the pay award and the pensions last year for schools. So just to make that point there. In terms of the fair funding formula, we haven't changed anything on the fair funding formula for a number of years. We've looked at a formula that perhaps we could do regionally with our colleagues within South East Wales. That's not going to be possible to do. purely because we're all operating slightly differently, and if we were to move our formula to move nearer to Torvines, etc., then obviously there'll be some effects on us. What we have done over the summer and last week is met with a number of our heads as part of a working group to see whether there is small elements of the formula that we want to do. We actually looked at every single element of the formula to see how it's distributing, whether it's still distributing fairly, and whether our heads wanted us to continue with that method of distribution or change. There's about 3 or 4 areas that we are looking at to take forward on consultation. None of them will make massive changes to our schools, and at this point ALN is excluded from that part of the review. So it's things around how we distribute general allowances within the schools, the administration part of the schools, etc., etc., and just making it more, simplified. I know you raised some points at the beginning around the support for additional learning needs. I'm going to look at my colleague at the back, Jackie, to see whether you do want to add anything to that at all in terms of the support that's provided to schools. Sorry to drop you in this one.
Not at all, Nikki. Yeah, in fact, what we've been doing is being very proactive and met with nearly every one of our primary schools. In fact, your school, Councillor Grocott, is one we're meeting with next week because obviously you've had a temporary head in place. So we're doing that. So what we've been doing is working with head teachers and ALN codes directly to look at the whole of the ALN population in their schools, discussing with them and working with them very proactively on looking at the individual needs of the children and how we can work more proactively to make sure that the funding they get has the maximum impact in terms of those teaching assistants delivering targeted interventions. This is very much something that head teachers have welcomed. We had very, very positive response to this when we spoke to the head teacher meeting in the summer term, and it fits very, very well with an initiative that's actually coming on board in the new term. Now we've got a training pack called Step Back, which has been developed regionally, which is very, very exciting. Actually, I'd love this select committee to actually to have more information about this at a future date. It's about really encouraging independence in children and actually a very, very robust training pack about how our teaching assistants can work more effectively. So ALN funding is always under pressure. It's always something that hits the headlines, if you like. But I think actually what we're doing is working smarter and making sure that children in our schools in Monmouthshire who have additional learning needs are getting the support they require.
Councillor Grocott.
Thank you. Just to come back briefly, if I may. Nearly half our schools heading for deficit. It's great to know that you're meeting with heads to look at the budget line by line. That sounds a bit like moving the deck chairs on the Titanic to me. But assuming that you have successfully undertaken this consultation with heads, is that going to actually affect the percentage of schools in budget at the end of the year?
It's difficult to say at this stage. Probably not is the answer, because, as you say, the pot is still the same. So if we're distributing more through general allowance, we're distributing something, less through a different element. Our heads were very keen to understand how the formula works. And I think it was a good exercise in the fact that we haven't done it for a number of years with our heads, and we've got a lot of new heads. But there is, as you say, there's no magic pot of money to inject into the base budget. It's just a case of making sure that where schools are spending, they are receiving that funding correctly, and we're not overfunding other schools and underfunding others because of the nature of how they're working.
Councillor Louise Brown.
Yeah, Chair, have you widened this a bit? Because obviously we've talked a little bit about ALN, so I did want to ask some questions in relation to the original presentation. I'm looking in particular at page 15. where in the it says revised activities include a budget of 300k has been set for many years to support school-based redundancy. The majority of these are as at the 31st of August. To date, we have only had noticed that the support required is 126k. By releasing 100k as a one-off for this year, we should still be able to meet the commitment. This is non-reoccurring. And then there's some comment at the bottom of page 15 about holding a budget of 300k. So it doesn't quite make sense there. And also in the report that we're coming to at a later stage, it says in the first instance 300k will be used for the budget side of the proposal to close Mountain House School. Now, you know, obviously, if you're talking about this, then you know, there isn't any actual maximum costs of redundancy for the 31 staff who are there. And obviously, if this budget is used in that way, then in a sense, it'll be over budget because of the possibly because we don't know, because we haven't been provided with the possible costs on the later report. So I think, and also if this budget in the first instance of 300k is used for Mountain House, what happens to the other redundancies that take place later in the year for other schools, which will then be over budget? Thank you.
Okay, if I just explain the first part of your question around the 300,000 and whether it's recurring or not recurring. As I said, we budget 300,000 per year for redundancy costs within our schools. In the current financial year, 1920, we have seen not many redundancies come through, and therefore, out of that 300,000, we have been able to release 100,000 to help the general position of CYP. While we say it's not recurring, it means that when we start the financial year, if agreed with Cabinet, that is the year that Mountain House would actually close. So when we start the financial year 2021, that budget will stand again at 300,000. Okay, so that's why I'm saying it's non-recurring. We've made a one-off saving this year, but it will go back up to 300,000 next year. In terms of if we were not doing anything exceptional around schools in the normal financial year, if the budget is overspent on that, it's very clear, made very clearly to schools that they pick up that overspend. So if it goes 20,000 overspent, if a school is facing redundancies and has taken money from that budget, they will need to pay their proportion of that overspend. And that's been happening, that's happened a couple of times over the last 3 or 4 years, but as I said, the last couple of years we've managed to stick within the 300,000. Obviously, a decision will need to be made around when and if Cabinet take the decision around Mountain House. And, you know, where we've had closures in the past, and I can't preempt any decision around Mountain House, but when we've had closures in the past, we've had to look at central funding for those redundancies. If this budget is here and it is underspent, it makes sense to use this budget in the first place. But as I said, until Cabinet take that decision, we'll not be making any agreements around the redundancy costs.
Councillor Louise Brown coming back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I have difficulty with that answer because effectively what you're saying is that schools pay a proportion of the overspend, and in fact, you know, obviously, if a proposal to close a school, there's not going to be a proportion of overspend because that's going to be you know, obviously the school wouldn't exist to deal with that overspend. So it will actually be the rest of the school's budget that will be impacted elsewhere, the main schools, if there is an overspend. And I think that ought to be clear. And we're already seeing the problems of the general school budgets. And, you know, you've just actually confirmed that this will have a detrimental impact on the rest of the schools. Thank you.
Can I just come back on that? Because it's not what I said, actually, to be fair. The budget is there for all schools, 300,000. In the normal course, where we are not making any decisions about reorganising schools, if under the current provision, schools collectively take 320,000 out of the pot. The 20,000 is split across the 10-11 schools that have made those redundancies, and then they pay that back into the pot. Where we have an exceptional circumstance, if and when it occurs next year, then obviously we would need to look at that in the exceptional circumstance. Now, if the other 34 schools are only using 150,000 of this budget, I would anticipate that the decision from Cabinet and from Central colleagues is that we use the other 150,000 to support Mountain House. No decision has been made at this stage about Mountain House, so no discussions have been made around the redundancy and how that will be funded at this stage. But I can categorically say it will not affect our other mainstream schools.
Okay.
So could I come back on that? So basically,
briefly,
it's flexible to do whatever you want and use whatever funds you want. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the budget that's been outlined by our two colleagues this morning? Any other questions? Okay. I mean, in terms of summing up, I think it obviously there is a concern, and it was expressed in the joint select in terms of the increase in budget as far as children's services is concerned, but there is very little we can do about that, and obviously we must look after those children, and it's very difficult to budget in terms of what's going to happen in terms of family breakdown or what's going to happen in terms of court decisions, and as an authority we cannot refuse to do that, and neither would we want to refuse to do that. So it is a difficult budget to manage, particularly on as far as child services is concerned. In terms of the school budget, excuse me, I was at the meeting last week of CYP financial meeting, and it's obviously a matter of concern, particularly to head teachers and to governing bodies, to manage now very, very tight budgets, and that is a huge challenge. And it is, I'm sure the scrutiny committee are concerned that we've got nearly half of our schools in deficit. Hopefully that might improve over the year in terms of recovery plans. But that is a matter of concern, and it's something like 850,000. It's nearly 1 million now that schools, in effect, are short of. So I'm sure everybody here is somewhat concerned, by that. But thank you very much, the two of you, for coming in today and taking us through the budget. It is useful, and it's obviously something that this committee will continue to scrutinise and look at. So, thank you very much for coming in this morning. Diolch yn fawr, thank you. We'll move on now, and we're going to now move to agenda item 5, and I'm going to hand over to two colleagues from EAS, Helen Power, who's the Principal Challenge Advisor for EAS, and then Ed Price, who's the one of the Assistant Directors, and they will take you through. There are some new handouts coming about with slightly less lines on them. I think it will make for some clarity. So I hand over now to EAS, and obviously Senior Officer Will McLean will be here as well.
Diolch yn fawr. Bore da pawb. The reports, the reason for the new handouts is because on the charts, the regression lines on them, when they were converted to PDF to share with you electronically by committee services, there was a degree of jitter, for want of a better word, in those lines. There's clarity on these ones. Introduction. You'll remember that Helen and I and Will came to committee to talk about key changes over the course of last year. In the summer, we talked about the changes to foundation phase to key stage 3. We would normally at this time of year be providing you with a foundation phase Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3 report, which had Monmouthshire aggregates on, league tables of positions, etc. The context of this report will add on to the information we provided in the summer to explain why that is no longer the case. So on page 1 on the paper versions, if you've got in front of you, the first paragraph, there are legislative changes made to teacher assessment information in Wales, which is to reduce their use for accountability purposes, in effect, to state that teacher assessment information should be used at school level for self-evaluation and school improvement purposes. As a local authority, as a consortia, as challenge advisors are deployed into school, they will still have that range of information available with them to work with individual schools and look at the performance of individual pupils. The reason for that in the next couple of paragraphs is that international research suggests that where an accountability system puts pressure on individual schools' performance targets which are published, schools will focus on those targets rather than necessarily what is right for the individual learners in their care. Therefore, that is the rationale for the changes. There will be a renewed emphasis, fourth paragraph down, on assessment for learning. Not to say that assessment for learning has gone away, but that it has perhaps there's been too much emphasis on end of key stage teacher assessment rather than what's the right thing to move learners to the next step in their learning. So arrangements that will remain on the 5 bullet points. The ones related, national reading numeracy tests still in place, teacher assessments still in place, still recorded. Head teachers will still report the performance of individual learners to parents. Governing bodies will still produce those annual reports. Governing bodies, as I know many of you are governors, are still entitled to this performance information for you to scrutinise at a school level to check that the school is heading in the right direction. The last 2 bullet points there, schools, governing bodies, local authorities will still have access to their data for self-valuation purposes. And the 5th one, Welsh Government will continue to collect data to produce averages across Wales, but they do not expect local authorities to aggregate up performance data at LA level. So, arrangements that will change, and I did cover these briefly in the summer. No comparative information. We do not know which each local authority in Wales did. There are no families of schools anymore at this level. There are no benchmarks anymore at this level. And the Welsh Government are not producing those comparative reports in all Wales core data sets. And my local school website no longer includes that teacher assessment data. It still has the finance, context information, but not teacher assessment. So end of key stage teacher assessment is driven on an annual basis and still takes place following the annual guidance, and there's a picture of the front cover of it. It's available on the Welsh Government website to state what schools should do. It's incrementally changed each year. That is still carrying on. There is still school-based standardization and moderation for the core subjects. And top of page 3, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, cluster group moderation took place this summer. The local authority delegate their role because they have the powers of monitoring the system within the area. They delegate that to EAS, where challenge advisors and subject advisors visit selected clusters on a rolling programme to ensure the robustness of the process. So the process still takes place. It's the use of the data that emanates from that process. So just reminders before I go into the data. At foundation phase, we are looking at the performance of 7-year-olds. This is middle of page 3 in language, literacy, communication, English and Cymraeg, mathematical development, personal social development, well-being and cultural development, and the abbreviations for those are included because those are sometimes used later in the report. At the end of the Key Foundation phase, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, the expected levels and the higher levels remain the same. So described in those sentences, outcome 5 is still the expected level for our 7-year-olds, outcome 6 still the expected level +1, the higher level for more able learners. At Key Stage 2, it's the average learner expected to achieve level 4 and level 5 for more able. And at Key Stage 3, it is level 5 for the average learner and level 6 for the more able. Those will explain the charts later when we come on to them. So the charts, important paragraph at the bottom of page 3. The data, and In a way, you'll have to forgive us in producing these reports because in a way we are learning with you on what is the best way to respond to these Welsh Government changes, because we're meant to be producing non-aggregated data and we're also meant to be producing anonymised data. So the solution of what to produce in the middle is quite tight, if that makes sense. But we are trying to produce an anonymised view of schools for you, which gives you a feel for where the local authority is without actually aggregating that data. Okay, I'll come on to them when you see the charts in a couple of pages' time. Page 4 is just a repeat of what I'd said, but in a visual way of the expected levels on the top chart. Outcome 5 in red, level 4, level 5 at each key stage, phase key stage, and the expected levels +1 at outcome 6, level 5, level 6 for the foundation phase, key stage 2, key stage 3, respectively. To add on to what I've said on context, and I'm not going to read all of this out, but on page 5, there was a joint letter from the Welsh Government, Estyn and the WLGA to the range of predominantly directors of education, chief executives, chairs of scrutiny, cabinet members, and the consortia on what their expectations were for the publication of this data. So in producing this report, we are very much responding to those 2 paragraphs there in the information we're providing to you as scrutiny. So, bottom of page 5, the LA performance data. The charts below are providing a performance of all schools in the local authority, anonymised and non-aggregated, compared to schools in the region. All the orange dots represent a Monmouthshire school. All the grey dots in the background represent a school elsewhere in the consortia. We would love to be able to produce these charts so we can compare it across all of Wales, but we do not have the data availability to do that. So we have to do it just for the consortia. The single line through each chart is the line of best fit across the region. Again, I would like to be able to publish the line of best fit for Wales as a whole so we can see where we fit. There is not a significant difference to it in any of these, but we do not have the data or the formula to produce that chart because Welsh Government have not currently published it and say they do not intend to publish it. Rest assured that the challenge advisor for those individual schools will undertake a far more thorough analysis of the individual school performance where they will have access. They will obviously know the name of the school, know the names of other similar schools around them for self-evaluation purposes. So, final bit before I go into the data. This has to be set into the context of school development plans as well, because the real reason that we should analyse our performance is to inform the school development in the future, to identify the areas that we need to address. As a region, with local authorities jointly, we are taking a range of work to improve the quality of school development plans. There is a regional agreed approach, the front cover of which is there, agreed with directors, to work and challenge individual schools on their development plan to ensure that they are fit for purpose, address the performance deficits that those schools may have in order to improve for the best of all learners. So that's a final part of that jigsaw in terms of changing. If we have a look at the data, on page 8, and I've tried to pair these up. So on the top chart, you've always got the performance of the expected performance, and then on the bottom chart, you've got performance for the more able. You have the grey dots in the background overlaid with the orange dots for all Monmouthshire schools. In school packs, and school packs are still being published by the EAS for head teachers and can be seen by governing bodies, this would be a single red dot and all the other dots grey, so you know exactly where you are on the school, on the chart compared with other schools. What we have on these charts is our least socioeconomically disadvantaged schools on the left and our most socioeconomically disadvantaged schools on the right. You will see the majority of our schools are clustered in between the 0 to 20% free school meals group. If we look at the line, it is not as blunt as saying above the line good, below the line bad, if that makes sense. There is a legitimate area of random chance in a way around that graph. I can't put a number on it statistically, but if you imagine a band around that line, we are looking for schools by exception. There is naturally one on this chart, isn't there, on the top chart, at the 10% free school meals line, where there is 70% performance, We know who that school is. The challenge advisor knows that their performance is there. Helen, as PCA, knows, the local authority know, we will be working with that school to look at why, look at prior performance. It could be entirely reasonable that there is a cohort of 10 learners and 3 learners have not achieved, and all 3 learners have significant special needs. Rest assured that analysis will take place. These draw your attention to the schools that you need to ask questions of rather than make a judgment of. On the bottom chart, the outcome 6, you will notice that there is far greater scatter, because naturally the more able cohorts are smaller in each school, so it varies by year much more naturally. There is more scatter across the region, there is more scatter within Monmouthshire. We would certainly be looking at those 3 schools in the 20 to 30% achievement level to ask why, and look at and explore the individuals below that. Rather than make a judgment that that is poor performance, we ask why of those schools and look at the school development plan to see whether schools are addressing that appropriately. The summary I pretty much covered there on page 9, but they are overleafed, so you can see them side by side. If we move on to mathematical development, you actually notice at outcome 5, the fit is much, much closer. There's probably maybe one school towards the top end, one school towards the lower, higher end of free school meals, where you would ask further questions of. On the outcome 6 chart for mathematical development, there is one school at the 10 and 20% mark. You will notice it's a different school to the English. So questions as to why, if they can achieve in English, why not mathematical development. I'm giving you examples of the questions that the challenge advisor would ask. If we go over leaf to page 12, you will see personal social development. You will see overall at the outcome 5, higher performance for nearly all of our schools. The line is much flatter, isn't it? Where schools are learners being awarded personal social development because our schools, our primary schools in the main, are very good at ensuring the well-being of our learners. At outcome 6, you will see much more variance, as you'd expect, as our learners progress at different stages, different rates of progress. But generally, there is less scatter for the Monmouthshire schools, and it is in line with the region as a whole. And bear in mind, Monmouthshire is contextualised here because it's done on free school meals. Key Stage 2 Cymraeg is the first chart on Key Stage 2, but there is no chart because there are only 2 schools with assessments at Key Stage 2. Therefore, we cannot provide those 2 because they would be readily identifiable. We've done that for every local authority, apart from Caerphilly, which has 10 Welsh medium schools. Rest assured, they are being looked at in depth by challenge advisors, their performance in Cymraeg at the end of Key Stage 2. If I turn over to page 16, you will see that the vast majority of Monmouthshire schools at Key Stage 2 for English at level 4 performing above expectation. There are probably 3 on the margins of being below, but they are not exceptions by to any particular extent. Questions would be asked by the challenge advisor of those schools. At level 5, you naturally have more variation, but overall you have more schools above that line of best fit for the more able than you have below. There are probably 2 that you would want to look at, schools below. You also have one school you can see on 5% free school meals where there's a dot right at the top where every single learner in the school achieved level 5. I can guarantee that that's a relatively small cohort, I would say, probably for that. But it could be 7 learners in the cohort, all have achieved level 5 for that year. The challenge advisor may ask questions there about the validity of teacher assessment and how confident they are about their assessments level 5. And I'm sure they would want to see books, look at the books to see, is this level 5 work that those learners have achieved. They will, of course, been through a moderation process where the rest of the cluster will have looked at those books as well, or samples of those books. So the summary analysis, overall performance in line at Key Stage 4, if not slightly above, and also above the region at level 5 as well. Mathematics is a similar story, although you do get slightly more schools slightly further below the line, but this is by, a single child in most cases. At level 5, you've got performance which is above the region as a whole, but you still have that little cluster of schools between 10 and 25% free school meals, those 3 where further analysis would be undertaken. If we move over to the science, Level 4 performance in line with the other two subjects. Above the region as a whole, you don't have any schools significantly below the line. At level 5, you have very high performance at a number of schools achieving level 5 at science, but you've got slightly more below the line of best fit than you have for maths, which is a question, say, right, is a science perhaps being given the same status as maths, English in that small number of schools? Has the curriculum delivery been sufficient to enable those levels? That might be about curriculum change as well. Key stage 3. There are only 4 schools on the chart, so these charts are give you a feel for where those 4 schools. You can see they're all towards the least disadvantaged end, but they are compared with similar schools to them, and you can see all 4 on top of page 22 in line with or around the expected performance. It is very low numbers of pupils that are not achieving there. You may ask questions about that one school, but it's still 9 out of 10 learners achieving the level 5 in that one school that is below the line by a couple of %. Level 6, there are more questions to ask because whilst performing well compared with every other school in the region, still slightly below the line of best fit for level 6 in our secondary schools, where again challenge advisors will have information to ask those questions. Forgive me with the maths and science. The summary is rather anodyne in that the performance is in line with the region as a whole. When you look at the page 24, virtually every dot is on the line. On page the bottom of page 24, level 6 as well, every dot on the line. When you turn to maths, science, on page 26, a similar situation, slightly more variation on the level 6 science. Okay. The following graphs, there is a change of style in the graphs because we did look at producing free school meal performance and gender performance on those scatter graphs, but that didn't work particularly well. They became very busy and you couldn't read into them. What we've included, sorry, I've got to cover page 28 first before I move on to those. Summary of key issues, and this is picking up issues by exception. It's not looking at the positives, it's looking at areas we would wish to look further. Performance outcome 6 is lower than expectation for a few schools of the lower free school meals, so more disadvantaged. At higher levels, we would want to work with those schools. Key stage 2, the higher level performance in science is lower for a few schools than level 5 performance in English and maths. Just compare that comparison, because if a learner can achieve in English and maths, you would expect them to be able to achieve in science. Key stage 3, performance at level 6 in English is slightly lower than expectation for those schools, but it is slightly, it's to explore further. The final chart, free school meal, non-free school meal. I will explain these. Basically, every pair of orange and blue lines represents a school. With the blue line, and the blue line is at the top, believe it or not, I'll explain why it is at the moment, is the free school meal learners. And the orange line is the non-free school meal learners. The top school, where it says lowest free school meals, doesn't have any free school meal learners in it, hence no blue line. So the orange learners, the 24 out of 28 free school meal learners achieved. If we look at the next school down, the blue line, 2 out of the 2 free school meal learners achieved, and 28 out of the 28 non-free school meal learners achieved. So it's 100% performance for each. Let's look at some of the examples where we might want to ask questions. Can you see the blank where it says 0 out of 3? Yeah? That would be 0 out of 3 school, 0 out of 3 free school, that's tough to say. 0 out of 3 free school meal learners achieving. We would ask why. It might be that those 3 learners, the CA, have significant special educational needs. They might have been targeted well below. They might have been targeted inappropriately. There would be challenge there to the school about why. Similarly, with the 0 out of 1s below those 3 schools, when you have very low free school meals and you look at an individual school, 0% can look disastrous, but when you have to look behind it, you understand the story of the individual learners. It allows you to ask the question to find out more. You've also got other factors that you would need to explore as the CA. Let's have a look at some of the other charts. Page 30, you've got the Key Stage 2 one. You can see 3 schools with no free school meal learners in, hence the blanks. You've got one with a 0 out of 2 there, which is 0 out of 2 of those free school meal learners. Generally, you'll notice at Key Stage 2, there are fewer schools with free school meal learners who don't achieve as they progress through to Key Stage 2. At secondary, Key Stage 3, page 31, you will see that in all of our schools, free school meal learners do less well than their non-free school meal peers. The numbers are actually 3 learners didn't achieve the top school, 9 in the next one, 5 in the next one, 2 in the next one. Are the gaps there? For the CA, it would be asking about what could have been done differently for those learners to have been achieved. What did you do? What would you do differently next time for those learners in terms of the provision to enable them to achieve? Were the expectations too low, for example? Were their targets actually set as level 4s? They would be able to look back at that data in detail. The next 3 charts are exactly the same. They're a little bit, they tell you a little bit less because they are the gender balance, boys, girls. Apologies for the traditional colours. The boys are in blue, the girls are in that salmony pink, orange colour. That's just by chance on the charts. You can see the differentials and you will see there is quite significant variation, isn't there? There are some schools where boys do better. There are some schools where girls do better. General trend is that girls do better at foundation phase, slightly. You would maybe ask questions about, can you see the penultimate school at the bottom of the list, where it's 15 out of 20 and 13 out of 22? 9 girls didn't achieve there. That's quite a large proportion of the cohort, even for a challenge school. So questions there. You've then got at Key Stage 2, you've got, again, the challenge advisor questions you would ask. The third school from the bottom, there's 3 learners, there's 3 boys, there's 3 girls, asking questions about those individuals. At Key Stage 3, final page, page 34, you have a situation where you do have the gaps. They become more apparent between boys, girls, where in every school bar one where it is virtually equal, the girls do outperform, but those gaps are relatively small compared with the national picture. Hopefully that was interesting. As I said, we are learning with you on producing these charts, and it's trying to see the big picture on one chart, if that makes sense, rather than and dig into the right component parts. Thank you, Chair.
Will, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, if I could, thank you, Chair. Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People. I just wanted to say thank you to Ed and Helen. I think we're the first local authority to have this report in this way. We have tried absolutely to stick to the advice that we've been having from Welsh Government. But one of the things we're acutely aware of is the journey that some of you as members have been on since we were in special measures back in 2013. And I think one of the things then that was really important as a part of that recovery journey was us being absolutely clear with our elected members as to where our schools were, where their performance was. Now, some of the tools, and Ed mentioned these earlier on, the family of schools, the benchmark quartiles and so on, seem to be a language I had to learn. Now seems not to be as present as it once was. But I'm really grateful to colleagues for the work they've done in pulling this together. I think the other thing I just want to give committee reassurance about is the work that our colleagues in the AS do, the challenge advisors, and then colleagues within Monmouthshire do, working with the AS to make sure that those questions are asked and answered appropriately. And we've talked about the links to the school development plans. Any of you as governors will know the importance of those documents in terms of how we go forward. And those SDPs will be signed off this year by the local authority for the first time. So there's an additional level of scrutiny and sanction through that process. And for some schools, we will ask them to come in and to work with us to understand how they're reflecting on their performance last year and what measures they're putting into their school development plans to make sure that they address those potential shortcomings that have been identified. So just wanted to say thanks and just to clarify what we're doing in response to those changes.
Okay, thanks, Will, and thanks, Ed, for that very comprehensive presentation. Any questions, any comments or questions? Peter.
Thanks. Can I just ask, how confident are you that free school meals provides an accurate measure of the level of social deprivation and indeed the extent to which external factors affect the learning of a or can affect the learning of a school?
Okay, the decision to use free school meals as a proxy indicator for deprivation was taken by Welsh Government probably 25 years ago, I would imagine. They have attempted to use other models, such as incorporating elements of the Wales Index of Multiple Deprivation, SEN ratios in schools, language acquisition in schools, and those went into the family of schools. We're in a situation where it is the measure that has been used for a number of years. There is no replacement for it as yet. Therefore, we continue to use it in these charts as the best available. What I would say is, the larger the cohort, the more reliable it becomes. So you'll notice the charts for secondary, where there are larger cohorts of 200, 100 to 200, it becomes more reliable. For small primary schools, with free school meal figures, you will have natural fluctuation, and you have to be sensitive to the challenge advisor in analysing those to recognise that is not the be-all and end-all. It's also, and I think this is critically important for us, it is not a label, whilst it's a label on the individual learner for PDG, Pupil Development Grant, it is not a label on the learner for sort of limiting their achievement. I think we have to be acutely aware of that when it comes to free school meals, that you have to look at the individual. It's a proxy indicator across cohorts, that's all. Okay.
Come back, Peter, yeah.
So, Mr. would it be fair to say that free school meals is a fairly blunt instrument? It might be the best you have, but it's still a fairly blunt instrument.
I think the key point is it's the one that we have. Therefore, we have to use it. Estyn have used it for a number of years quite strongly, as a Welsh Government.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes.
Things are evolving, though.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions or issues? Councillor Martin Grocud.
Assessing school children is going to be contentious, however it's done. There is a move, and you've represented it here, to teacher assessment. My concern is that to be effective, that relies on teachers being able to competently undertake that assessment. I've seen figures in my own school as chair of governors to suggest that that's not always been the case. How are EAS supporting schools to make sure that teacher assessment is actually accurate?
The prime tool that we've had to improve teacher assessment over the last decade or more has been cluster moderation. In that, schools are expected to standardise internally and to take portfolios of work which have evolved now into learner profiles to their peers in the cluster. What we have noticed since over the last 6-7 years, since we have been consistently visiting on a rolling programme across schools to look at the process has become far more robust and consistent across our region as a whole. The practices in Caerphilly and Monmouthshire are more tightly aligned than they've been ever been, for example, as two different local authorities. And the messages from those are then scrutinised by the challenge advisor to ensure that any messages from cluster moderation, which perhaps highlighted anomalies in practice or concerns, are then implemented back in school for the subsequent year and fed and distributed back to all teachers within that school as well. With the subject specialists as well, predominantly in the core literacy, numeracy, Cymraeg, they will also have a hand in the training that they do for teachers on accurately judging a level 5 for work, for example, with the models that they provide so that people understand it. I don't know if, Helen, you want to add to that?
Thank you, Ed. Okay, Martin. Just in addition to what Ed has said there, the whole process of assessment for learning is looked at clearly in cluster moderation, the standardisation work that the school does, but also through the year, not just in the summer when these cluster moderations happen. So the work that the challenge advisor will do with the head teacher, with the learning network schools. We've got such a range of support going into schools now, particularly those schools that need extra support, those in the red and amber categories. That work will be something that the CA may well do in a joint book scrutiny with the head and with senior leaders, just to see where they are with their accuracy on teacher assessments. It may be a joint work scrutiny. Also the work that those learning network schools are doing. Some of them are leading on assessment for learning, so they will be paired up with schools that need that support, and also with all the professional learning that is offered from Deb Woodward's team. So they're focused there on that.
Yeah, I think Will wants to come in on this.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think, again, this is one of those areas whereby the information available to us is changing how we're working. So one of the, and I'll be very clear that the national tests do not assess the same thing as teacher assessments. But one of the things we always used to be able to do was to look at where teacher assessments place schools and then look at the outcomes of the national tests. And it would give us just a sense maker in terms of did we think where things were. And so one school that we were significantly involved with had very, very high levels of level 5 teacher assessment. And then when you looked at the national tests, they had a very, very low level of children who were exceeding 115 as the point. So that gave us a bit of insight into understanding, do we need to ask some different questions in that area? I think what both Ed and Helen have talked about in their answers is the fact that actually this challenge advisors being closer to schools, in school, doing that work throughout the year, and in the same way as Estin have, that very clear focus on what's in the books and how do the books look, gives us a much stronger degree of evidence and confidence as we work through the year to be sure when we come to the end of the year and teacher assessments are submitted, that nobody is too far away from the line that we would expect them to be.
Councillor Grocott coming back.
Yeah, just very briefly, the figures we've got here are end of key stage. Does the same effort go into moderation at the end of every year group? Because it seems to me that perhaps the most effective way of measuring the success of a school is to look at the outcome of kids where they start and then do the same when they end. And if you do that, I mean, you know, some of our Monmouthshire schools here, the results look absolutely fabulous, and you look at how many free school meals kids they've got, and the answer is none. I've known schools that have been outstanding where very few children at the end of their time in that school actually get to where you'd expect them to be. But when you look at where they've started, they have still made remarkable progress. And those are the kids that I'm most concerned about in terms of equality of opportunity and so on. Now, the process that I know it's not an EAS process, it's a Welsh Government process in a sense, but can you assure us that you are supporting schools to the best of your ability to be able to show that progress from day one to the very last day?
We still have a statutory target setting process where schools have to set targets 3 years in advance. So at Key Stage 2, the statutory is that you would set targets in year 4 for the end of Key Stage. The easy target system, which we introduced a couple of years ago, building on previous systems, actually allowed schools to set targets in year 3. So as soon as they're in Key Stage 2, you set high expectations early. And the critical bit is that schools are tracking that progress. We would recommend, this isn't statutory, we would recommend a minimum of 3 points during that year, perhaps on a termly basis. Schools would have their own internal systems for tracking the progress that every learner is making. It's critical for us.
Okay. Any other issues? Councillor Brown.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, this is sort of a change in how assessment is done, and I presume this is following the Donaldson report that was talking about not measuring the PISA results every 3 years and publishing the data on numeracy and literacy. I mean, the problem with that is obviously we don't know then how Wales is comparing with the rest of the UK, and you know, because these are internal school measures that aren't published. The other concern that I've got is that effectively I assume this is teacher assessment data, and there's all these little dots on here, and the orange ones are the Monmouthshire schools. But you've already said about the fact that teacher assessments don't necessarily line up with you know, what the outcome would be if you had a sort of an official type of test. I think this is one of the things that you were saying, or have I got that wrong? And the other thing I would like to say is that it's a bit difficult for us as a scrutiny committee if the internal results of the school aren't published, or if in general we don't know how Monmouthshire compares to the rest of Wales. So how will we know what it's doing? Because this is talking about South East Wales, and previously we've had results to say, you know, at key stage such and such, Monmouthshire has got this and that. And, you know, it's easier to understand that data than it is to, you know, for dots, because how will we say, you know, can we look at this dot here and can you explain what that means? I mean, obviously it's easier for the secondary schools than it is for the primary schools, because obviously we've only got 4 secondary schools, so it's easier to measure them. But with the primary schools, because there are a lot of them, it's very difficult to actually pinpoint what needs doing. And the other issue is that although the parents might be told how their child is doing in comparison with the average outcome for their age, we don't know how the school is doing in general terms. And I think, you know, this is some of the issues, is that you're collecting the data, but in a sense, because it's not nationally published, it's going to be pretty hidden. And, you know, it's difficult for, you know, parents and governors to actually understand the differences that are actually going on here. And, you know, I do think it's going to make it much more complicated and difficult for both scrutiny and parents to know exactly what's going on in general terms in our schools in Monmouthshire in comparison with the rest of Wales, because obviously we're only looking at South East Wales here as well. Thank you.
Will. Thank you, Chair. I'll start, and then I know Ed will want to come in. Just in terms of being really clear about what I said about teacher assessment and national tests, what I was saying was they assess different things. So what I said was we used to use it as a broad barometer in terms of outcomes. They are not comparable. So that's absolutely the first thing to say, that, and I certainly in no way inferred that actually teachers' assessment would be different to national tests. They're doing different things. I think your point, however, the underlying point, is valid, and it's something yesterday afternoon as the directors in South East Wales, we spent a long time talking about how we present these reports, do we disclose the names of schools and so on. We have absolutely gone as close to the Welsh Government guidance as we possibly can here. So what we're trying to do is to give you that ability to see the performance of Monmouthshire as a system, to see how well our schools are doing in comparison to South East Wales, which is the only other data that we have access to. So Welsh Government's decision not to publish those numbers is not within my gift. So we are being as transparent as we possibly can be here without naming schools, because that would go against the spirit of the advice that we've been given. So we're trying to be as clear here. Now, for all of you who are governors in schools, when you have your performance packs, when you have your head teacher reports that come back, you will talk about the specific outcomes that your school achieved, and you'll be able to see that performance set against Monmouthshire schools and the rest of the whole region. So we're confident that what we're doing is the right thing in terms of how we're reporting. I think I said in my opening remarks that this is going to be a significant shift this year in how we've done it previously. And to some extent, you know, I'll absolutely put my hand up and say, you know, that some of the comfort of being able to say to people, we have, you know, 75% of our schools are above the median, 45% are in a benchmark quartile 1 was a significant confidence and comfort to us in how we described our performance. But the whole piece and the whole landscape of accountability, how we use accountability, is changing and moving on. So I think I think not necessarily linked to Professor Donaldson's work, although that's a key driver for all of our work in Wales, but certainly the work that the OECD has been doing with ADU, which is the Association of Directors of Education, and with ESTIN, is all around actually moving beyond accountability as something which we do here, and actually making sure that it's something that drives the improvement. And that's the key transition that we want to see.
Just agree completely with the approach, and it is one we're taking. It's outlined on page 5 in terms of our response to Welsh Government, ESTIN, WLGA. We are trying in these reports to meet those requirements. I think in time, these scatter graphs will actually give you more information than perhaps saying we were 2% above the Vale of Glamorgan. If that makes sense. Yeah, what does that tell us in terms of how our schools have performed? Or we're 2% below. These actually give you a picture of the component parts of the system and what's contributed, but in an anonymised way. Yes, if we could, you'd almost perhaps want the names of each school by every dot, but that's not going to happen with the way that, with the declarations from Welsh Government. The other point I'd like to make is regarding PISA. PISA's still taken place last year, and PISA results will still published. Nothing's changed whatsoever in terms of Welsh Government intentions there. The other point, it's not a change to the teacher assessment itself. That hasn't changed. It's a change to the use of teacher assessment data is the critical point. That's all to add.
Very briefly.
Yeah, just to come back on that. I think one of the suggestions is you've got these orange dots. Well, you could still have the schools anonymous if you gave them a numerical number, like 1, 2, 3, 4, because then it will be easier to ask questions. School 1 on page such and such, is a dot well below the other. I think that might help improve the scrutiny side, where you could keep it anonymous, but actually sort of number the school. And the same in the charts that we got before. I think it would make it slightly easier to understand in terms of presentation.
Okay, Will, yeah.
To see if it exposes, I think it might make them look quite busy, but we'll look at that.
I think the other thing, just on that point, Chair, I think this whole movement, the whole reason why we're reporting in this way is because there was a very, very clear position expressed about the movement away from high-stakes accountability. I'm not sure that us discussing individual schools, which is where we would end up in a committee setting, is aiding that direction of travel in avoiding high-stakes accountability. That seems to be increasing the visibility. What we're trying to do is to build a really strong and robust evidence-based, data-based discussion with our schools that allows us to have those discussions with them to understand where they are. What you should see as the fallout of that and the impact of that is a changing in our categorization results. That's where you should see that come. You should have more confidence in terms of the number of schools that we have who are inspected and their inspection outcomes. So we're expecting to see an impact there rather than having this high stakes piece of work early on in terms of what the outcomes are. So we're trying to fit to the direction of travel that the Welsh Government have very, very clearly established, as in this change away from high stakes accountability, but that certainly doesn't move us away from high expectations about what our schools are doing.
Thanks, Will. Maggie.
Thank you. I enjoyed the way, actually, the dots were presented, simply because of the particular school that I'm associated with. I knew exactly where my school was. And anybody else who knows their free school meals in their school could roughly work out especially if they're a member of the governing board, because you know from your head teacher's report. So I did find it very, very helpful. Luckily, I'm not colourblind, so at least I could work out where the dots sort of were. But I also liked the distribution because you could see where the demographics were. You could see what we were doing as a county for those schools who had such a variation in outcome, when they had the same number of free school meals. And I agree that, you know, it's a rough tool, but it's the best tool amongst a rough batch. So I think it gave us other information that we're not discussing here, but it does give us a chance to scan what's happening, what we're doing in view of earlier conversations with looked after children, and the fact that I hear on the hearsay, and I were experiencing as well, some of our children are definitely coming in with lower cognitive skills, and that will show up on this kind of graph and will show up on the stats that are coming through. So I'm sorry, I'm at variance with my colleague, but I quite like the way it was done, and I'm not very good with graphs, but I could understand what it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie Harris. I think we've come to the conclusion of the questions that obviously I'd like to ask, like to express my thanks to Ed for the presentation and his colleague. But just to sum up, obviously the issue came up about how accurate is free school meals as a guide. There's not a great deal we can do to change that. That is a Welsh Government benchmark, and it's used quite widely. Obviously issues in terms of how accurate are teacher assessments, and in reality assessment is always difficult at whatever level, whether it's Key Stage 2, GCSE, degree level. People want accountability, but obviously some concern there. Lastly as well, whenever there's a change in a system, it does take time for everybody to actually bed into that and to understand it. And this is quite radically different. Personally, I think it's a good move in that it takes the heat off schools in terms of parents and public. Where's my school? Where's the next school? And so on. But it's a system that we can't change, but as I'm very grateful to Ed for taking us through. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Before he goes, because this was very clear, and I found it very good to relate to. So, thank you very much.
Okay, we move on now. Conscious of the time, it's now 11:25. We move now to agenda item 6, and this is scrutiny to offer a view on the proposals for Mountain House School. Will is going to lead on this. I'm sure he's familiar now. He's presented to the political groups and to CYP Finance and so on. Jackie Elias is going to come forward as well. I said it in the pre-meeting, if we could keep to 10 minutes, as it were, for the presentation part, and then take questions, and really they should be focused on questions rather than statements. But I will not allow anybody to go on more than 10 minutes. I think that's quite a long time, actually. But we will time that. I know people have strong views and feelings about this, but hand over to Will now.
Thank you, Chair. And I think it's a really good opportunity for us to be able to bring this report to the committee prior to its consideration at Cabinet tomorrow, as it will allow, I hope, you, Chair, to make some representations to Cabinet as to how this committee forms a conclusion. Members will be aware that I've briefed this committee several times in the past about Mountain House and the future direction of travel with regards to how we support our learners with additional learning needs in Monmouthshire. The report, which is before you today, will be considered by Cabinet tomorrow. And I think the key part for us to note at the very outset is the recommendation 2.1. And we as officers are recommending to Cabinet tomorrow that they do publish the statutory notices that set out our position, which is for the closure of Mountain House School at the end of August next year. I will be very quick and run through this paper. I will avoid the the temptation to filibuster for the rest of the day. But we'll start off in terms of the context. So Mountain House is a boys-only school. It serves boys with an age of 11 to 16, and it supports boys who have social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. It was established in the 1970s under Gwent County Council. It has capacity for 58 students, 42 of whom could potentially be residential. Currently, there are 15 students in the school. I know the report says 16, but following publication of the report, we've had notification from the school that another child has not returned to Mountain House this year. Of those 16 pupils, 8 either reside in Monmouthshire or are Monmouthshire's responsibility as the corporate parent. Of those 8, 2 are residing in Monmouthshire but are belonging to other authorities. If we roll time forward a year to 2020, that number would drop to 5, with the 2 children who are not our responsibility but residing in Monmouthshire, that would be 3. The designation of Mountain House is an important aspect in our considerations, and social, emotional, behavioural difficulty accounts for now only 13% of our entire additional learning needs population, those who are statemented with the most significant needs that need support in our schools. At the top of page 2, we set out that the consultation exercise was conducted in an open and transparent manner. It did attract a significant amount of interest and attention. There were 123 responses to the consultation process. 109 were against the proposed closure, which was 88%. Throughout the report, and particularly in the table which starts at the bottom of page 4, we will set out our response to those consultation views. Just in terms of background, I've talked a little bit about the history of Mountain House, its age and the children it serves. More recently, and absolutely recognise that Mountain House has been on an important improvement journey. In 2015, it did experience a significantly challenging period of time. The school was placed into an ESTIN statutory category and was categorised as a red school. And I think the one thing we've done throughout this consultation process is absolutely recognise the work of the staff in the school that has now moved it out of that category and into a yellow category for support. And that is a school that requires significantly less support than others. Last year, Cabinet consulted on some changes to our ALN provision, and one of those was concerned with the extension of Mountain House to become a broad-range special school and to use the Mountain House site as a hub for pupils with SEBD and autistic spectrum disorder and the broader range of additional learning needs that would then manage that provision within the other hubs, within the other spoke areas that exist across the county. So they are the 2 55-place special need resources bases in Caldicot and in Monmouth, the 22-place base in Overmonnow and the 24-place base in Pembroke. And we are currently working with Derry View School around establishing an assessment unit there. So this would have been a very different model for how we did that. There were 2 significant pieces of feedback that came around in terms of those proposals. There was a significant level of concern expressed among the consultees last year around the management, the governance and the responsibilities around that new model. There was also concern around the ability of a hub whose experience was limited to SEBD with boys about how they would manage children with profound and multiple learning difficulties, etc., in a broader setting. So there was that one response, and then the second response, which is set out in 3.7, concerned the financial cost of renewing the school. I know some members will have been around the school. The school is, as it stands at the moment, not fit for purpose in terms of its fabric, in terms of the building itself. Additional challenges of bringing in the full age range, boys and girls, would have cost significant amounts of money. I note that there has been some response in terms of where did that number come from. That number was calculated by Property Services within Monmouthshire using the renovation multiplier set out by the Building Cost Information Service of the Royal Chartered Institute of Surveyors. working on the floor area that exists within the school, and that came to £6.4 million, which is a significant amount of money for the local authority, clearly. The key part that I just want to touch on next is regards to the strategic purpose and the use of the school. We know that children's needs are becoming increasingly complex, but we also know the dynamic within our additional learning needs population is changing. And the graph at the top of page 3 quite clearly sets out that the level of children with SEBD as a percentage of our statemented population has risen from the period of 2012 to 2019 by 3%, from 10.31% to 13.02%. However, compare that to the number of children who are requiring support for neurodevelopmental autistic spectrum needs. That has risen from 21.24% to 31.11%. So that is by far and away the most significant element of the children that we need to support. We set out quite clearly in 3.11 that Mountain House currently, with its current designation, its focus on boys and secondary age, means that we are simply not able to meet the needs of our vulnerable learners within our communities. And I think that's the fundamental point in terms of why this proposal has come forward. 3.12 also is an important table, because what that demonstrates is that there have been significant numbers of referrals to the school in the past period. So in 2014 there was 38, 2015 24, that coincides with the challenging year I mentioned earlier, 2016 29, 2017 37, 2018 19. You'll see, however, that the number of Monmouthshire referrals to the school remains very low and almost constant through that period of time, with 2 a year for the first 3 years, rising to 5 and then back down to 3. There is very little need within Monmouthshire for us to provide a school for boys with SEBD, and that's a key part of our thinking and our rationale. 3.13 looks at future need. It sets out, and I'll read this one because I can't quite, the number of girls with a diagnosis of SEBD is markedly lower than the number of boys. So as of July 2019, of the total population of SEBD, only 6 were girls compared to 35 boys. Even if we assumed that all SEBD children in the future, so all who were in the foundation phase or key stage 2, could have their needs met in Mountain House. And it's important to note at that point that it might not be the provision that is right for them. And that's a decision which is made by colleagues who work, by our ALN team, by educational psychologists, in conjunction with parents. We cannot presume that 100% of pupils, just because they have that designation, will determine that that is the right school for them. And I think that's important that we remember that. The total population would only require 21 places. If you set that against what's coming through with regards to autistic spectrum disorder, that's 41 places. So we're looking at a very significant difference in the level of need as it comes through. In terms of the financial case, I'll go to the top of page 4 first of all. The financial cost of running Mountain House per year is £1.26 million. This year we anticipate recovering £471,000, giving us a net cost of running Mountain House of £788,000. This means that the cost per pupil this current year is £131,000. In comparison, we charge children from out of county £45,000 to attend as a day pupil and £77,000 to attend as a residential pupil. That compares to £45,000 a year for Headlands, which is run by Action for Children, and Talaka, which is an independent school, costs about £65,000. So our own costs for supporting our own children are significantly ahead of our recoupment level and are significantly ahead of the market equivalents. So it's very difficult for us to argue in the economic case, which is set out in 317 to 319, that the school offers us and the needs of our population with additional learning needs good value for money in terms of how we can invest to support them in the broader setting. And I think that's a key point. 320 picks up the response to the consultation exercise. There are 4 key themes that were identified during that process. The first is that there was a concern that children wouldn't cope in mainstream education, and that those already in mainstream education would be disrupted by the placement of children. I'd always hoped that I'd been very clear and unequivocal in these settings that we have absolutely no intention of placing any children from Mountain House back into a mainstream school, and that is absolutely the case. Theme 2 was that there is a concern that there is no other alternative provision that is suitable for the children and the young people at the school. In a different to the previous paper that we brought to Cabinet, we've been very clear in this paper as to the arrangements that we will put in place to support the children in the school should Cabinet make the decision to progress with the decision to publish statutory notices and the school close at the end of August next year. All of those plans will be informed during the year, and they will be informed by the appropriate planning process that we have to undertake for all children with a statement of additional learning needs. There are two different approaches. The first is for those children in Key Stage 4 who we will create a bespoke individualised pathway for. And for those children in Key Stage 3, given the longer time that they will have to remain in education, we will look for appropriate placements for those children. All of those arrangements are costed out, set out in 3.35, and again in 6.1 with regards to the financial implications of this decision. With regards to Theme 3, a view that the Council needs to maintain special provision due to growing demand for additional support for school with additional needs, we concur with that view entirely. What we are saying is that we need to support our children, but we need to support the full range of need within our community, not just one very, very specific designation, age range, and suitability for boys alone. And finally, the view that the Council should invest in Mountain House, this is Theme 4, to develop a provision that meets the future needs of our community. And as I've just stated, we are in agreement with that. We do need to do something different. We know that our level of ASD coming through our schools is significantly higher now than we've experienced in the past, and we recognise entirely that that provision must be met. So the rest of the paper really just sets out how are we going to support those children should the school close, the costs associated with that. And then finally in section 5, we go on to the reasons as to why we're making those recommendations. I think quite clearly, and it's important, 5.1 is recognised there, this is not a decision that we have taken lightly or rashly or with any other motive other than to find the right provision for the children in our schools and in our population. When Mountain House was created in the 1970s, things were different, I think it would be fair to say. At that time, Gwent would have had a population of about 600,000. Monmouthshire now has a population of 100,000, and its scale and remit are no longer compatible with the needs of Monmouthshire. I think as we saw the school go through that period of difficulty, we saw other local authorities step in and create their own provision, and I think that has led to a fall-off of some of the out-of-county placements that we've seen. As we experience this growth of ever-complex needs amongst our children, it's really important that we create the right type of provision for our children. I think we will see a movement away from specific designations, and we will see a more holistic offer to support children with complex needs. And I think that is the direction that we have to take. I think the issue for us is that Mountain House has reached a point in time whereby the building is no longer fit for purpose, and the designation of the school itself no longer meets the needs for Monmouthshire. So at this moment in time, it is our recommendation that the school does close, but we are absolutely clear that we recognise we do have to make provision for those children with autistic spectrum disorder, and it's not something that you can simply transition from one school into the other. And I think that's one of the key messages, if I can leave with members today, is that actually the needs of a child who has autistic spectrum disorder, although to some they may present in a similar way in the classroom, the way that a teacher first experiences that child may feel similar, actually what drives those needs, the environment, the support, and the educational offer they need will be very different. And I think it's really important that we recognise that. Thank you, Chair. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Will. Start with Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr McLean, for giving the Labour group some of your time last night to outline these proposals to us in some depth. I think you will have got the message from that meeting that as a political group, we largely support much of what is in this report, and that as a group, we feel that having a school for boys between 11 and 16 who have emotional and social difficulties is one that is very difficult to sustain in this day and age. And in that context, I think Monmouthshire is actually quite slow off the mark in terms of many authorities around Britain in dealing with this particular small group of youngsters. However, you will be aware that there was a difficulty or two, and so if I could just question you on this, and hopefully you'll be able to give me some sort of reassurance. The first is around, I think, the staff we have there. Staff who work with such challenging youngsters have a very special skill set. That is in many ways different from the skill set of an ordinary mainstream classroom teacher. There are people who are working with the most difficult youngsters, and certainly the staff and the regime in the school at the moment, as you've said yourself, are doing so very effectively. I think the Labour group would like to hear assurances from you that that group of people will be able to continue to use their expertise perhaps in a more effective way than working in one school stuck down in one little corner of Monmouthshire. The second thing is a specific difficulty we have with youngsters who are there now if the school does close next July. And you'll remember some of the comments last night around the need for reassurances that the specific youngsters will have bespoke packages that represent more than the vague promise in the report that provision will be made. We want assurances that they will be very specifically tailored packages in a very appropriate place for every child. And there was concern that if that could not be met, then the progress of those youngsters would be disadvantaged. And in that perspective, the whole thing might be called in for further consideration after it goes to the Cabinet and the County Council. If you could reassure us now in committee that those two areas will be addressed, then it would go some way to reassuring the group that I'm representing here this morning in asking these questions.
Thank you, Councillor Grocott. Well,
okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Grocott, for the questions. In terms of, I'll take the second one first, if that's okay. So, as I said, we are, I think one of the very clear things, when we did go out to consultation initially, we went out and the closure date at that point in time was to be the 31st of December this year. I think it became very apparent very quickly that that was not an appropriate end time. And so we've changed that on the feedback that we had in that consultation exercise. What that does afford us is the opportunity to work with the children and with the school and with the staff in the school to really plan very clearly for what happens with those children in the next year. So the vagary, if it is vague, and apologies if it is within the paper, I think what we've tried to do is to be clear around two differing approaches depending on which key stage the children are in. And then to look at a model which is appropriately funded, appropriately costed out, and will give us that framework to enable us to do that. I know Jackie will be doing that work with our educational psychologist teams to do that planning work. So absolutely, it's certainly, and you know, I've had conversations with the head teacher of the school, as you would fully expect over the past period, and I think very clearly Bev's focus and attention, as ours is making sure that those children who are impacted by the closure of the school experience the very best education that they can going forward. So I do believe that the additional time that we've afforded, the 2 additional terms, I think the focus on working with the boys, the way in which we've been able to identify specific resource does allow me to make that reassurance to you that absolutely those students in the school will receive a continuum of education that is absolutely appropriate to meet their needs. With regard to the first question about staff, now in some ways that's slightly more difficult for me to give a specific and categorical reassurance on. The reason being that, and again in a sense, the year is both of benefit and a challenge in some respects. I think what we've said and what we've described is that clearly for some of those members of staff in the school, there will be now a time when they will begin to look for other opportunities, and we will support them in all they can do around that. If Cabinet agrees that this should progress to statutory notices, then the local authority's protection of employment policy will be invoked at that stage. So those members of staff will rightly be given the protection that that policy affords them. Now, clearly there are a relatively high number of staff in the school at the moment. There are 31 members of staff in the school for those 15 students. So my ability to commit, as I sit here today, to ensuring that all of those members of staff will be employed elsewhere to work with those children is very difficult. It's also a responsibility of the governing body, which is also a step removed from myself. I think what I would say is that as we go forward, as we seek to look for development in the future for that broader set of provision, we will always look for effective and experienced staff to do that. I think the one thing that I would say is that we've talked at length around this changing the dynamic, the SEBD and the ASD. The type of staff, clearly having a caring and supportive approach to children, wanting to work with children who are vulnerable is a significant piece. But we'd have to be confident and ensure that those staff are actually qualified and have had the necessary experience to support those staff. So clearly they are caveats, obviously, to your question, but we always seek to support our staff whenever there's a challenging period of time, as we are in now, and I absolutely recognise that. But we will absolutely seek to do that, of course.
Okay, thank you, Will. Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you. I'm not really sure whether to start by suggesting an alternative proposal or just go through some of the more passionate comments that I wish to make. Basically, 88% of the 123 who responded to the consultation on the proposal to close Mountain House School were against the proposal. If the 2,333 who signed a petition were added to that number, then the opposition will grow to 99%. Yet the recommendation in the Cabinet report to the special meeting is not to take proper account of the thousands responding against closing the school, discount the majority of responses, and not listen to the school staff, residents, schools, parents, governors and councillors who responded to the consultation. The partial response to this consultation, then having discounted in the usual meaningless jargon the responses of the majority, then went on to agree with the views of the small minority in favour of closure. In my opinion, the report to Cabinet is no less than a shameful travesty of justice, looking for shorter-term gains but failing to see the longer, bigger-term growing and widening ALA and need in the county, and will end up being much more costly in both financial and human terms. I am urgently calling upon the Cabinet not to support the recommendation which calls for the next stage of the statutory process on school closure. Instead, the Cabinet could ask to support last year's proposal, which was clear-cut, invest to save, to widen the school, and which covers both ASD and SEBD. Most of the arguments on closing the school are based on its narrow provision and can be used in the reverse to support last year's proposal to argue for a wider ALN school, including girls and those with ASD, not just boys at Key Stage 3 and 4. In addition, the lowering pupil numbers, particularly from out of county, and resulting in increased costs for Monmouthshire pupils, may be well attributed to the uncertainty over the future of the school, which the council, by its own actions, has inadvertently contributed to, and other Gwent authorities having their own ALM provision. So why on earth is Monmouthshire County Council not doing the same and developing its own provision instead of proposing the use of a pupil referral unit, which is meant to be a temporary provision as opposed to a bespoke provision, and by whatever that means, or paying privately for those to go to private or charity-run schools in Monmouth or Penarth. This is contrary to the recent catchment development policy, which talks about Monmouthshire pupils being able to access Monmouthshire schools. And indeed, there's 16 ALM pupils, including girls, who assess out-of-county private provision. Last year's Cabinet report said it would save 500k. The main reason last year's proposal didn't progress was because of the 606.4 million needed to change the school for a wider provision. And it would be far better to support the school and gradually widen its provision, and to build a new school in the 2024 schools programme, when 75% of the capital for special schools comes from the Welsh Government. It means that for a 7 million new school, it will cost the county council only about 2 million, which is equivalent to last year's original budget. Instead, there's a suggestion in paragraph 3.41 and 3.42 of the report that the longer term provision might be a wider school provision. What sort of provision will this be? What are the costs involved? And surely it is better and much more cost effective to invest and save in Monmouthshire's own school. So really, I mean, I think the bottom line is, if you look at the history of this, last year there was a far better proposal that would have dealt with the whole thing, that should, I think, be put forward as an alternative to Cabinet. I mean, the Estin last year said that this was the most cost effective. Estin this year have said that while the school's been opened, you haven't fully considered the other alternatives. And, you know, there is a financial case, because if you go back to looking at the history of this, in March 2018, there was about 33 pupils on roll. And then now there's only 8 from out of county, previously 25. So it actually means that as a result of these different consultations, and first of all the one to widen the school, saying there would only be Monmouthshire only pupils, putting out of county schools off, and then secondly then reducing the budget, and then thirdly proposing to close the school, then one wonders why the numbers have decreased. You could actually, on the figures that I've worked out, which are financial figures based on reports to this authority, if you went back to the between 21 and 33 pupils, it would actually cost between 21k or up to 75k per pupil. And then if you widened it, obviously you'd be saving on the approximate 1 million costs that you make for your 16 out of county children who are girls or with ASD. So it doesn't make financial sense to me to go for this proposal. And the longer term aspect is this idea of another school. So why aren't you doing it now? And it's unfair to staff not to look at that previous proposal, and you know, I can't see why this is in the best interests of those with additional learning needs, because it simply isn't. And I don't think it's an ill thought out proposal. There was a good proposal last year that was supported by it actually was supported between March 2018 and it was only in about December when they actually looked at saying, oh, well, it's going to cost us 6.4 million. But even then, you know, you could still go to widening the school at a later stage. And girls...
I'm going to have to stop you there a minute, Louise, because I think...
Well, I'd like to come back on a proposal if I could. Thank you.
Sort of cut to a proposal, because to be fair to Will, I think there's so much in there, it'd be very difficult, you know, because obviously you've given your opinion on the proposal and on various aspects of it, but I think you need to come in now on a proposal or a question, really. Because
Well, I think the proposal would be basically going back to the option that was actually put forward on the 6th of March 2019, which was option 3 in that paper, which said about changing the type of provision offered at Mountain House Special School to meet the requirements of the in-county growing need. So I think a better version of that would be to change the type of provision offered at Mountain House School Special as a local authority school to meet the requirements of the in-county growing ALN need on a gradual basis, because you could then get back to the higher numbers. And I appreciate that the answer will come back to say, well, you know, out of county schools are having their own provisions, so why on earth isn't Monmouthshire, when there's a table of 130 pupils between 3 and 19 with ASD and SEBD needs, and the report last year said that there was a growing need for this school. So it doesn't make sense. The arguments are still there. There's still that hidden need, and I don't think the proposal that's being put forward will deal with that. And at the end of the day, we'll come back to the need for widening the provision in any event.
Right, thank you, Councillor Brown, for that. I'd like to let Will respond now, but I say it's going to be quite difficult because there's so many issues in there. But I think the key thing is that third proposal in terms of widening the scope of the school, probably 4 to 19, co-ed, and covering a wide spectrum of special needs. But obviously that would be a long-term transition. But hand over to Will McLean now.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Brown, for your views and for your recent contributions as well. In terms of the position, I think we felt that we were able to answer the themes that had emerged in the consultation exercise. I think, the theme which emerged around people being concerned around placement into mainstream schools, we were able to explicitly state that that was not the case. So we haven't simply dismissed them. We've identified the key themes and we've addressed them in a clear way. With regards to the round of consultation we have undertaken, I don't think we've discounted anybody's views. We have taken those, we've looked at them, we've considered our position, and then we have reached a conclusion. I don't think that describes partial activity. I think that actually describes an approach which looks at the whole round and tries to come to a very difficult conclusion. So I think language around things such as a travesty of justice, I don't think is a fair reflection on the work that colleagues or myself have undertaken to reach this conclusion. As we go forward, I would just like to draw your attention then to your commentary around consultation responses, and in particular, having to follow this year's consultation response, but not last year's, which I do think is an interesting position. So last year, when we did consult on the expansion of Mountain House, there was a concern, a significant concern noted during that consultation exercise that led us to not proceed with that. So in light of that, we have followed the consultation exercise response. And that is, so we're doing that. So this year, we've looked at the consultation exercise and we've responded there. I think as well, that the use of the PRU that we set out in the papers is exceptionally limited. The PRU would simply have the ownership of the new intervention that we put in place for that very small number of children in that year. Simply in the Key Stage 4, which I think is 4 pupils, potentially 3 actually now, I think. 3 pupils. So we would simply use that. So this isn't to put children back into the PRU settings in any of our other provision where we work. The escalation to the £6.4 million, I think the school needs a huge amount of money spent on it. I think the notion of a kind of make, do and mend kind of progressive adaptation to the school would simply not meet the needs for the acute needs of children who are going to be placed there. I think also the citing of the 130 as the total pupil population, we do already have a range of provisions. So that 130 is not the total population who would potentially be eligible for the school. So our 2 special need resources bases at secondary, both have a designation for complex need and can support children with autistic spectrum disorder. Now, for our most needy children, or those children with the most significant levels of need, that would not be appropriate. So there will always be, in an authority such as Monmouthshire, some children who we have to look somewhere else for in terms of that. But for a number of those children, actually we do have provision at the moment, and through the reforming agenda that we're embarking at the moment, with new head teachers and so on, I think we're confident that we can enhance that as well. I think as well, the notion that we have, through actions either deliberately or as a consequence, sought to run down the school, I think is what you were suggesting with regards to the uncertainty and the budget. For a significant period of time, the school was funded on its capacity rather than the number of children there, which is something that none of our mainstream schools have the luxury of. All we have simply done is to make amendments twice in the last 5 years to make the funding closer to a per pupil funding rather than the capacity of the school, as we have seen numbers decline significantly. So my comments with regard to the proposal are that at the moment Mountain House is not suitable for the children. If we look at it if we really to look at it and talk about the state of the facilities in the building there, we would say actually as an environment it's not the environment we would want. If we sought to extend it beyond SEBD to autistic spectrum disorder, I think we could say that with absolute certainty that it's not the environment that would support them achieving the best outcomes that we would want them to achieve. We do commit clearly in the paper to recognising that in future we will need a different type of provision within Monmouthshire for our most complex children. We commit to that quite clearly around developing provision. This is 3.41. We will develop provision in Monmouthshire to offer education to children and young people aged 7 to 19 who have difficulty in learning because of a range of significant and complex additional needs. So we're not doing that. And I think one of the things, and I've always tried to stay away from analogies and to comparisons and so on, but in this kind of notion that we can kind of ad hoc adapt and change and morph Mountain House into something does a disrespect to the people who are working there now and disrespects and misunderstands the needs of the pupils who you are citing as being potential pupils in the future. I think the most important thing at the moment is that we resolve the position with regards to Mountain House for our pupils. And I know that sounds, I'm very cautious about saying that because it does sound parochial. But if someone was to come forward to this committee and say, we're going to build a new school for 6 pupils, I think this committee would clearly advocate a position that there would be better ways of us using the resources that we have available to us. So we resolve this issue. We've committed to additional provision. We recognise the need for that, absolutely. But this is a stepping stone on the way to delivering that.
Thanks, Will. I know Councillor Laura Jones wants to come in now.
Thank you. I think in answering Councillor Brown, Mr McLean, you've answered many of my questions already. I'd just like to back you up in the fact that I too believe that this is just not a cost-effective thing to do, is to keep the school open. I think it's far too costly, as you've pointed out, the price per head of pupil, particularly the amount of Monmouthshire children there is. And that's what we have to do as a committee and as a council. We have to think about what is actually best for our children in Monmouthshire. And as bluntly as Will just put it, we have to look at it. It is built a school for 6 Monmouthshire children, and that's just crazy. And then the fact that Councillor Brown, yes, it's a great idea to sort of extend the school and everything else, because it is archaic in the fact that it's just boys only and for the needs it meets at the moment. But it's just not possible. If you look at the financial side of all of this that's come out, it's just not possible to carry it on. It's a nice idea, but financially, where's the money going to come from? Is it going to be at the behest of a new school in Chepstow or something? Is that where you're thinking the money is going to come from, that we're going to magic out of thin air? You have to be realistic about this, and it's just not realistic going forward. The needs of the children, I do believe, will be better met because they are specific needs in the way that's been outlined already. I'm just wondering, so if the provision in North Monmouthshire that you mentioned, Will, what are we going to subsidise people going to that from the school? I mean, how does that actually work? I wanted to know that, please. Thanks.
Okay, so the provision in North Monmouthshire is Talaka. So Talaka School is an independent special school run by the Priory Group. If and when we do determine that children have their needs best met in Talaka, we meet the full cost of that provision.
Sorry. Yes, my point was that it's such a wide spectrum across people, children in these conditions. There's so many different conditions that you need to really have them put in places that are suitable for them. At the moment, Mountain House only takes certain ones. And I think, as well as the fact they haven't taken any girls, which I think that should be a way found to give them a special education to cover the different aspects of it, not just to sort of try and cover one lot of children. And this is where I think the money could be spent in different ways to make this provision, hopefully, additional to additional schools that we've got now, because we have got sections of schools where they can have that sort of teaching attached to the schools we have now. And if that could be looked into and further that provision, I think that would probably be more of an answer. I don't know whether that's...
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. I think it's really important to underline the fact that the principle under the current code of practice and in the new code is that wherever possible, pupils with additional or special education needs are educated in mainstream schools. That's the underpinning principle that we've been working with for the last X number of years with the current code and going forward. So within that, we've got 4 resource-based settings with 2 secondary, 2 primary. It is exactly as you describe about working more closely with those schools to enhance their provision so that needs can be met on a more local basis. And I think that is something we are developing an SRB network group within Monmouthshire so that we are being very proactive and working far more closely together on a whole range of issues. And I think one of the themes that are coming through the discussions this morning is around the idea that you could change Mountain House School into something that could meet the needs of children with more complex neurodevelopmental needs. Now, you know, my experience and it is over 40 years in education, so I think it is valid, is that, you know, this requires a group of staff who have had and are able to very specialist training, and a school that is able to demonstrate that it is able to implement highly sophisticated therapeutic interventions. Now, you know, Mountain House School, as well as already described, has, you know, the staff there work extremely hard, but they are not, as far as I'm aware, and certainly the head and governing body haven't made it evident in any of the consultation responses that they've submitted, have any specialist training in the areas of need that we actually see as a growing area within Monmouthshire.
Okay. Thank you, Jackie. Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think I'd like to come back. I mean, I've spent an awful lot of time studying all of this in absolute detail, and you know, to suggest that the consultation response last year wasn't taken account of. There were 40 people who responded, and it was broadly positive. And you know, there were press reports to say that this was going to be modelled on the idea of the Trinity School, Caerphilly, and so forth. And going through the history of it, basically the main blocking point was the 6.4 million borrowing requirement as opposed to the 2 million borrowing requirement, and that can be dealt with through the 21st Century School. And with regard to Councillor Jones' comment about how it would impact Chepstow, I think that's a bit disingenuous because of the fact that under the 21st Century School programme, out of a school that costs 7 million, it would only cost the county 2 million, because 75% of the capital costs are provided by the Welsh Government for special schools. So if you're saying that you know, we won't take account of the original budget to alter the school, then you know, maybe that is an argument, but I don't think it's quite correct. And in terms of borrowing, obviously, you know, the 6.4 million that was talked about, that was a desktop exercise and didn't look at things like how you could practically do that in the past, there have been girls as well, and obviously there's a saving with regard to our own pupils who are out of county. And, you know, I think the weight of the argument really is on looking at the alternative provision. And with regard to ASD and the training on that, some of the pupils at Mountain House School already have SEBD and ASD, and that's what I've been told. And
on a point of clarity,
yeah, well,
their statement for of additional learning needs, they wouldn't have been able to go to Mountain House if they had that diagnosis. So there may well be children in the school who people identify as having autistic traits. That might be something that has happened. But actually, I think I'm correct in saying that this has been one of the things that has come from the school that has been limiting their admissions. So if you're now saying that children actually can go to the school with that dual diagnosis, and that would be against what we understand to be our admitting policy and the work of the panel. So I think we need to be really clear, and I think this does come down to the work we do with our professionals to really understand how we deal with need. And actually, you know, we've had cases ongoing very often around where children present with autistic traits and so on, and some approaches that might be beneficial, but actually that's very different to children with confirmed very, very significant diagnoses of very, very significant levels of autistic spectrum disorder. You know, we have a population where we are sending children with such specific needs to out of county, not the two schools mentioned in the paper today, but with highly, highly specialist needs. And you need a very, very specialist environment to support those children. And I think that's really important. So to bring the notion into this debate that the school is currently providing for that need is a very, very difficult point for us to accept.
Very briefly.
Yeah,
now,
sorry,
Councillor
yeah. I mean, with regard to ASD, this is effectively a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's quite obvious that there is training available. And if you wanted to widen the school, you could increase the training and the expertise of the existing staff to do that, and I don't see that there's a problem in doing that. And last year you were quite prepared to widen the school along those lines, or basically if you increase the number of pupils in that area, then presumably then there will be additional staff to deal with that particular issue. Anyway, I mean, basically the bottom line comes down to this 6.4 million, and if you look at the history of it, but recently there has been a suggestion, and this is Central Council borrowing, and recently there's been a suggestion that the Caldecott Leisure Centre can be updated to include the borrowing of 6 million. So, you know, it's a question of priorities, and education should be the main priority as leisure services is discretionary. Thank you.
Can I, Chair, just go back on one point, and I know Jackie will want to go back on the comment about the training of members of staff. I just want to be really clear about the consultation last year. Under the consultation last year, Mountain House School would have closed. And that is categorical. We consulted on the closure of Mountain House School, and a new school on the site would be built, and that was the difference. So this notion about this transition is now nothing that we've consulted on previously. That's a different proposal again to what we consulted on last year. Last year would have seen the closure of Mountain House and a new school open on the site of Mountain House. Perhaps our language wasn't as accurate potentially as it should have been, and we should have described a new school in Pulmeric, and that might have removed some of the, or aided some of the clarity that's needed with regards to that. Just with regards to the 21st century schools, just a couple of words of caution I might offer. At the moment, in Band B, Welsh Government is supporting special schools with a 75% intervention rate. We don't know what Band C will look like. We don't know the quantum of capital in Band C, and we don't know the intervention rates in Band C. Clearly, between Bands A and B, there have been differentiators already. So we know that that can change, and I suspect they can go up and they can go down as well. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind. Sorry? Absolutely, of course.
Can we go through the chair now, Councillor Brown? Will have been interrupted.
So, with regards to that, I've also spoken to Welsh Government recently about Band B, and at the moment within Band B, there is no additional flex. I've spoken to Catherine recently, so that door, in essence, remains closed to local authorities for the time being. Jackie, I know you wanted to mention the training.
Yes, thank you, Will. With regard to the training, it actually wouldn't be for the local authority to impose on a school a training regime. It would be the responsibility of the head teacher and governing body to actually identify that need, which if as you claim, they say they've had children with ASD there, which we would know no knowledge of, there's no evidence that they've actually done anything in terms of developing specialist training in any of the neurodevelopmental needs that we've described in the paper, particularly ASD. I can't see on their webpage, for example, anything that in terms of therapeutic interventions that is even vaguely specialist, frankly. Most of the interventions they describe are things that you would see routinely in any good school, and particularly any good specialist resource space, which we've already got. The professional learning plan that they've got on their website has no mention of anything specialist in terms of training. It mentions very appropriately curriculum reform, racing standards, all of which are laudable, but there has been no ambition within the school to actually develop their level of expertise, which could lend some strength to any argument that they were prepared to take those children with more complex neurodevelopmental conditions.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Does anybody else want to come in now with any comments? Councillor Pavia was observing today, but is a Chepstow councillor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to attend this morning. You know, I think there's a real danger, particularly for the Cabinet, to ignore nearly 2,500 people who are against this proposal. You know, that's first and foremost. I certainly think those signatories should be classed as against in a formal consultation setting, although you know that they may have not formally responded to the questions as stated. In terms of, I think what Councillor Grocott alluded to, I think was absolutely right. You know, is it limited? Yes, it is. I think, you know, the response from officers has suggested that, and I think, you know, in agreement with staff who are currently there, they would agree that service provision is limited. So why don't we look to expand that scope? You know, I think certainly the uncertainty because of the authorities' various consultations over the last 2 years hasn't helped local authority commissioners looking at service provision. I'd be interested to understand from one of the local authority responses they do not have confidence in Mountain House. I don't know whether you can unpack that response or what that means. You know, that's potentially quite disappointing. You know, as Estin pointed out, you know, why didn't you look proactively at a new model provision while the current model is in situ? Now, I'd be interested, you know, there was a big focus on the neurodevelopmental work, and Jackie might be able to sort of unpick this as well. How, in terms of an additional model, whether it's external provider or which undoubtedly you've been potentially working with for future provision, how would that clinical intervention work on site? Is it a multidisciplinary team? Is it staff just there on site? Do you obviously bring in or potentially bring in external provision from the third sector to help? But what would that model look like? I'd be interested to know what the views of our educational psychologists have been to the proposals, if you can expand on that. In terms of the surplus budget and potential redundancies, I'd be interested to know, you've obviously ring-fenced a £300,000 pool there for closure costs. What happens to those potentially, if we breach that £300,000, particularly redundancy costs, where that additional money comes from? The future generations evaluation. Now, you've put in there about the anxiety of parents, pupils and staff, and they should be kept informed at all times. I just would like to know when were staff informed of these potential proposals that were going forward. I mean, I spoke to staff on the weekend, and the first they knew from it was from the local media. Well, how are we keeping them informed? I think that's all for now, Chair, and I might come back on with supplementaries if that's possible.
Will, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think there's some directed to Jackie.
Yeah.
So I'll let Jackie pick those up. As I said in response to Councillor Brown, I don't think, we clearly recognised the fact that there were considerable challenges with regards to the proposal we were taking forward. The 2,500 people who, some of the thing which is, as we look across the consultation response, some of them do not, there's one from a local authority that says the provision should be retained. That authority has placed one child in Mountain House in the last, I think, 5 years. Yeah. That doesn't sound like a local authority who's using that resource on a regular basis. I share entirely your comments and your concerns around the view expressed by one of our neighbouring authorities around the school. And that, I think and I hope that was very much largely to do with a previous leadership and a previous environment within the school. But it's not so far ago. 2015 to 2017, the school was in significant improvement, and that will be something which all commissioning managers will be aware of when they're making their placements into other places. With regard to the surplus budget, the 300,000 we keep is a reserve every year for school-based redundancies. If this goes ahead, it will not affect that 300,000, it won't impact on the mainstream schools. And I think that was picked up earlier in the discussion as well with regards to the treatment of that reserve this year. With regards to communication with staff, I'm disappointed if that's the case. Sharon and I met with school leadership, very much offered to go and talk to the school, as I have done at every single stage, gone and spoken to governors, to staff, to parents. I've done the boys once, Jackie's done the boys at the last time. We've done those things. So the last time we offered and were told, actually on that occasion, that the leadership of the school was going to do that. So how that hasn't happened, I don't really want to get to on a live stream, so we'll follow that up. But absolutely, our colleagues within HR have met with staff, have been supporting staff, and will continue to support staff. There's a meeting in the diary for the 25th of September to continue that support for staff. We are acutely aware that this period of time is difficult. It's inevitably very difficult for everybody. And we are absolutely aware of that, and we'll continue to support them. Jackie, I think there's probably a part for you to...
Yes, I think you asked about what a school would look like, a specialist school would look like if it was focusing on children with more broader neurodevelopmental needs, including autism. And I guess that really would be a school that would be informed by therapeutic principles. It would be a multi-agency team that would be in there, as well as teaching staff, one would expect, input from educational psychology, clinical psychology. Clearly, for a lot of children who are experiencing these needs, there would be a very well-trained and experienced staff who had experience of working with children with these kind of needs previously. So, I mean, obviously there'd be lots of, in terms of how that would look for Monmouthshire if that went forward in the future, that would be something that would be, obviously fully consulted on and developed in line with the needs of the children that we'd identified to go in there. But, it really does require, I think Will has mentioned in other reports that how research has developed over the last, 10 years particularly, with regard to children with neurodevelopmental needs. And I think the training and the support that staff required in order to meet the needs of children, and it needs to be able to match the progress that's been made in understanding the needs of those groups.
Paul.
Chair, so just to come back to that, Jackie, so potentially you could see a model where the local authority, the health board come together in some sort of shared provision. They would be potentially a pool budget, potentially.
I certainly can't comment on budget, but I would certainly, and the new legislation, the new ALN legislation is
There's a big focus on health,
is
isn't
a
it?
huge focus on health, and health as active partners in identifying the needs of children with complex ALN and actually providing for them as well.
Yeah, and that's why I can't understand that. The authority is making, I think, great steps in terms of Crick Road, and you think of that model with an external provider, in this case, Melin Homes as a social registered landlord. I've always liked to think ourselves as quite a pioneer and forward-thinking authority. How we're not looking at a third option here with a new model of care, working with the local health board, and potentially a private stroke third sector provider to optimalise what we've got in terms of an asset there where it's located. It's beyond me. So it's just too black and white. To keep status quo to shut. I'm just astounded by it, to be honest.
Will?
I think much of what you said then, Councillor Pavia, I can concur with entirely. I think the issue, and this is one of the things which, to refer to a different place, we did discuss yesterday, the transition from what is there currently in the current facility is so significant. I think that's the part, and again, if it's my failing in terms of my explanation, the change in provision that would be required for that school, it would be a different school. It might be in the same place, it might well have the same name. It would be an entirely different provision. So what we are trying to do is not to discount anything in the future, as we've clearly committed to in paragraphs 3.41 and 3.42. But we have to deal with this situation at the moment, because this situation has been going on now, and it's reached a point whereby we feel, as officers, that it's appropriate for us to make this recommendation to Cabinet to help us resolve this position before we go on and actually do something different in the future. So, the opportunities to involve the third sector, clearly we know that the third sector offers provision that meets some of our children's needs, because we've seen that in Headlands. So we know that the third sector can do that. We also know that some other local authorities in Gwent have been successful in accessing transformation funding to do it. So there is track record and evidence that we can draw on. I think actually what I would say is at this time, the black and white nature of the recommendation in this paper is to actually move us along in terms of the development. I think adding the third option in doesn't give the clarity in terms of this decision-making point. This decision-making point would have to be made at any point in terms of the development, whatever happens next. Now, I understand people's concerns that there isn't a seamless development from one to the other, but actually this will resolve as having a resource which doesn't meet the needs for what we have currently, and then allows us to develop something different in the future, which is clearly what we've committed to in the paper.
Okay, unless anybody else wants to make a point now. Obviously, there's been full discussion today, and we've had the full sort of variety of thoughts from Councillor Martin Grogan put forward the Labour Party point of view, and particularly highlighting on what's going to happen in the future, and that is crucially important. And certainly Estin have highlighted in very large letters there that they are not totally satisfied with the future provision, both for the youngsters in Mountain House at the moment, which is of paramount importance, but also for future children coming through the system with ALN needs. Obviously, Councillor Brown has put a very strong case for putting a third option, and I will ask her in a few minutes to read that out. Councillor Laura Jones supported the closure, as did Councillor Maureen Powell. I've got to say, I concur with Councillor Pavia. It's such a harsh consultation in the sense there are only two options there, close or status quo, and obviously the figures just don't stack up. I was concerned to read the Estyn suggestions and comments yesterday, as well when you read some of the comments from the youngsters who are actually there, who are happy, and when you read of one parent saying, well, my son was suicidal, now he's stable, for that child to move provision is going to be a major upset for them, and that could have significant effects on that person's future. But I'm you know, that's where we're at. I think we're fairly sort of divided. We've had broad discussion. The one recommendation that we've got going forward to Cabinet tomorrow, and they are the ones who obviously will make the decision. I will be attending tomorrow, but I don't think I can speak. But I'll ask Councillor Brown not to give the rationale now, but just to purely read out the third option and to see. We'll then vote, and only obviously elected members can vote on this. Co-optees cannot vote on this, or observers. So, Councillor Brown, could you just read out your third proposal briefly, please?
Yeah, it's to change the type of provision offered at Mountain House Special School as a local authority school to meet the requirements of the in-county growing AL need on a gradual basis.
People heard that, they're quite clear about it. Can I ask for a show of hands now from councillors who want that proposal to go forward to Cabinet tomorrow? Okay. And then those against? Yeah, this is where it becomes difficult when you're in the chair, isn't it? Obviously, we've got 3 voting for the proposal to go forward and 3 voting against.
What about the first 2? The recommendations, aren't we supposed to vote on those?
Yeah, Matt.
No, those are simply the recommendations that Cabinet have already received. What you've debated today and looked at is whether you feel, as a scrutiny committee undertaking pre-decision scrutiny, that having seen and discussed the evidence available to you today, that Cabinet should look at a third option. So effectively that the chair of committee attend Cabinet tomorrow on behalf of this committee, and ask Cabinet to also consider a third option as part of their deliberations.
I've thought about it now as we've gone through the discussion, and I think, in all honesty, and I've listened obviously very carefully to Will McLean and Jackie Elias, but I think in terms of fairness to the school, I think it's beholden on Cabinet to actually look at that third option, but obviously they will make the decision. I cannot make that decision, and neither can anybody on this committee. So I put my vote for that third option to go forward to Cabinet, and obviously I will attend Cabinet tomorrow to put that forward if needs be. Are people happy with that? Yeah. Okay. In terms of the rest of the agenda, obviously to look at the minutes for the last meeting of CYP, to confirm the minutes. I will obviously have to sign them now. Are people happy with those minutes? Yes? Accept that. In terms of the Children and Young People Select Committee Forward work plan, I would suggest for November, the Vice Chair and I went to Chepstow Comprehensive School, particularly to look at free school meal performance. And obviously there's a new head there, Matt Timms. He offered to come along with his deputy who looks at the statistics and free school meal children to actually come to CYP to actually talk about that, to give a presentation, obviously to be questioned about that. So if you're happy with that, we would issue that invite for the November meeting. We also discussed at length in Chepstow, and I don't know if you want to do that on the same day, but the issue surrounding Chepstow School and the sort of bleed of students across the border to Wydeen. Now, I don't know if you want to conflate those two, or whether do you think that would be too much on one day? What do people think?
Well, I think in fairness to the staff at Chepstow, we should try and do it together if they feel that that would be most appropriate.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's
Then,
difficult
and
for me
then
to
we
get time
look
out of school.
at those two issues. Anything else that we want to put forward? Okay. Other than that, then we will go as per work programme. The FSM thing issue is obviously a big issue, for this committee. So we'll invite Matt Timms and his deputy to come along, speak about FSM strategies and strategies in terms of trying to claw back students from crossing the border. And then 9, the Council and Cabinet Work Plan. It's there purely for information. It's as printed. The next meeting is on Tuesday, the 12th of November, 2019, at 10 o'clock. Thank you for your attendance today. Thank you for all your inputs. It's been quite a long, challenging meeting. So I hope you have a good journey home and a pleasant afternoon. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Okay, thanks. Yeah. I think I quite look forward to it. Thanks, Martin.